Hello, this is Dr. James Johnson, and I'm so grateful you've joined us for the next lesson in this series on the spiritual space. And in this series, we are working to understand the unseen world, to recognize God's original design for creation, his heavenly family and his earthly family, and how they were originally intended to interact and live together, and how, through a series of rebellions and disobediences towards God and God's design, the world has drastically changed, and as a result, most of us are ignorant or have very little interaction with the spiritual space. And so, as we've gone through this, we have started to understand God's original design, and we've seen the beginning of how the world was changed through some of these rebellions. So as we jump back into this, I want to encourage you, if you have not watched the previous episodes, please go back to those lessons and watch those videos first and then join us back here. And if you have, thank you for returning. Let's get back into where we left off. I don't know if you are a big fan of movies or literature, but for a long time I was a high school English teacher, and I love stories. I love narratives. I love plot lines. That means I also love not just books, but I also love good TV shows and movies. There's just something great about a good storyline that hooks you into it and carries you along for the ride. And one of the genres of storylines and narratives that we can look at is something called a dystopian story. And whether it's in a novel or a movie, dystopian literature, that genre is all about an alternative future where things have gone haywire, where something big has taken place that completely changes how human civilization operates. Maybe it's like the movies based on the book Divergent, where after a World War III, a nuclear holocaust has taken place, and society has completely, had to revamp itself based off of different factions and different, lifestyles that work together. Maybe it's the Hunger Games, where another example of a World War III, where now the surviving people live in different districts where they have to, volunteer a tribute every year to fight in the Hunger Games. And there's many different ones: Brave New World, Fahrenheit 451. All of these are dystopian stories. And my favorite was a movie that came out in the 1990s called The Matrix. And in the story of The Matrix, the plot line goes kind of like this: that after artificial intelligence was created in the 1990s, there was a war between the machines and the humans. And the machines won, taking humans captive and feeding off of their energy. They basically turn human beings into their power supply. And humans are trapped into a computer system called the Matrix, where they believe they're living an everyday normal life, but in reality they are asleep, and that the Matrix is a dream computer program that keeps them asleep and inert while the machines feed off of the electricity their body produces. And of course, in this dystopian storyline, there is a rebellion. People are no longer satisfied with the status quo, and they break free of the Matrix, and their goal is to overthrow the machines, to bring everyone back to the real world and to create a real life again instead of that fake one. Well, one of the things that we love as human beings is this idea of rebellion. The recognition that we, as autonomous human beings with free will, can dictate our own lives, that we are not held captive by others. And when anything takes away our freedom, we want to be reminded that we can rebel against it and create something new. And this idea created a lie in the hearts and minds of the living beings that God created. And the lie was that God cannot be trusted, that God's way is not best, and that people need to rise up and rebel against God. And that did not just start with human beings, it actually started in the spiritual world. And so in our last lesson, we saw how rebellions corrupted God's original design, that God's original design was for the heavenly world, the spiritual world, and the earthly world, the natural world, to overlap and interconnect with each other in a place called Eden, And God put a garden there on a mountain, the mountain of God, the mountain of assembly, and God's throne was there, his presence was there, and it created a space where human beings and spiritual beings could interact. But there was a Elohim, a spiritual being named Lucifer, who was one of God's throne guardians, who desired to take God's place. As a result, he knew he could not overthrow God because God is, all powerful, all knowing, ever present. And so he could not dethrone God. So he wanted to create a way for him to be like God. And so he led human beings who trusted him, because after all, Lucifer was one of God's throne guardians. He spent all day, every day in front of God's presence, and they knew him whenever they were in God's presence. They would have seen him and known him, and they trusted him. So when he caused them to question God's word, did God really say? They believed him. They ate the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, rebelled against their relationship with God. They chose to do things their way instead of God's way. And after breaking trust with God, many things happened to change the status quo. Now, human beings were no longer fit for God's sacred space, and they were cast out of Eden, no longer able to enjoy the presence of God because of their sinful selfishness that they were now corrupted with. The second thing that happened was they surrendered their birthright, that God intended for human beings to rule and reign over the planet. But what we saw at the end of our last session together was that by getting human beings to give up that space that God had made for them, Lucifer took over that space. And we're going to talk more about the difference between Lucifer and Satan. In our colloquialisms and in English, Satan and Lucifer are synonymous. They're interchangeable. But as we'll see as we get further into these rebellions, that the word Satan actually has applied to multiple beings, and it just means deceiver or adversary or accuser. And so capital S Satan is a proper noun for Lucifer. We also call him the devil. And so now we're going to pick up in a continuance of going through these 6 major rebellions that have happened in history in both the heavenly world and the spiritual world. So far in part 2a, in our last lesson together, we talked about Lucifer's rebellion against God and Adam and Eve's rebellion against God. Now we're going to pick up with our third rebellion to see how God's original design was corrupted by looking at the heavenly beings. Now, if we remember that the word for spiritual beings is the word Elohim. And Elohim usually refers to God, capital G-O-D, the creator, Yahweh, but it can refer to any spiritual being, any disembodied living entity that does not exist in the natural world. It lives in the spiritual world. And some of these spiritual beings can manifest themselves physically, but others are not seen. So we recognize there are many different Elohims and different jobs that they have. But as we look at these Elohim, these sons of God, there's something really important we need to remember that we often forget. And that is that Elohim have free will. God wanted relationship with the beings he created. He created the heavenly family to be his image bearers in the spiritual world, and he created the earthly family to be his image bearers in the natural world. And so, as such, he wanted relationship with them. He did not want robots. He wanted relationship. Robots are programmed. They can only do what their programming allows them to do. Now, maybe they can simulate life. Maybe they can simulate free will, but they cannot truly choose for themselves. They can only follow their programming. And when you have a program, you can't have a relationship with it. It may give the appearance of humanity, but it is not a human being. It requires free will. And God wanted that free will so he could have real relationships with his creation. And the same way that Adam and Eve had the free will to rebel against God, the Elohim do too, just as Lucifer did. And so what we recognize is that the vast majority of the living beings that God has created in the spiritual world, the Elohim, have chosen to stay with God. They have not rebelled. But there have been some throughout history who have rebelled. And we'll see the first example of this in Genesis chapter 3. So let's pick up where we left off. When we left off, Lucifer had rebelled against God, instigated a rebellion of Adam and Eve against God, and now Both of them have been cast out of God's presence, and Lucifer became the god of this world, and human beings are now living in the earthly existence now under the Adamic covenant and those consequences. So let's pick up in Genesis chapter 3. It says, "When humankind began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them." Now this is an important place to press pause, because one of the questions that I tend to get, it kind of comes in fits and spurts, but I do get it fairly regularly, is if Adam and Eve only had 3 sons. They had, Cain and Abel, and then after Cain killed Abel, they had Seth. How did they fill the earth? Were there other living beings that God created that aren't discussed in the Bible? And some people have developed mythologies where there were the people God created to live in Eden with him, and there were other human beings he created outside of Eden that were lesser. Sometimes they're called mud people even, or dirt people. There's all kinds of mythologies out there describing that. But the answer is far more simple than that. You don't have to have some convoluted, complex, mythological storyline concocted to make an answer for this. It's far more easy to wrap our brains around. We just don't like to think of it this way. Adam and Eve, after being removed from God's presence and starting their temporal life, limited by time, they lived, according to the Bible, almost 1,000 years. How many children do you think could be born of 2 people who are healthy in a 1,000-year period? My grandmother was the youngest of 14, coming from parents who didn't live to be 100 years old. So Adam and Eve would surely have had dozens of children over that time. Let's say they had 30, maybe even 20. Is that enough to start families with? Absolutely. Another important part of this is that genealogies and narratives of families usually only encompassed the main family members, almost always the oldest son. Every once in a while somebody else if they were important to the family, but as you study the genealogies, they only considered the oldest son. The reason for that is these genealogies were transferred and memorized by oral tradition, word of mouth. They would be told from one family member, the next family member would memorize it and pass it down to the next generation. So you couldn't remember everybody. You could only remember the most, prominent people in the family. So Adam and Eve had children who, yes, married each other. But they didn't know any different. They didn't have any other choice. It was just that, okay? So weird, yes. Understandable, yes. Now, I highlighted the word humankind here because in the Hebrew, it's not the word humankind. It's actually the phrase sons of men. Sons of men. And so, or other times, it's the daughters of men. And the word for man there's Adam, so it's either son of Adam or daughter of Adam, and it's meant to differentiate the sons of God. Remember in our previous lessons we looked at how the phrase Bene Elohim, sons of God, referred to the heavenly beings, and son of man, son of Adam, refers to the human nature. This is why it was so important that Jesus was both, and he got both titles. Jesus was known as the Son of God and the Son of Man. Because he was both. He was both spiritual being and a human being. Now, as we look at this phrase, they always refer to human beings, and they're going to be important as we go into the next verse. So when humankind began to spread on the planet, it says, the sons of God, the heavenly beings, saw that the daughters of humankind, the daughters of men, were beautiful. Thus they took wives for themselves from any they chose. Now, we can read this too fast and we might miss it. But this is outside of God's original design for his families. The heavenly family stayed in the heavens, and the human family stayed on the earth. But these sons of God, these heavenly beings, rebelled against God, left their place in the spiritual world, and came to the physical world to choose human beings as wives. And this is very important because this lets us know a couple of things. First, it lets us know that the heavenly beings, the Elohim, can manifest themselves in the physical world. And we see this on numerous occasions. The angels who went to Sodom and talked with Lot were physical beings that could be touched. And they were desired sexually by the men of the town. Abraham, before that, has a meal with the angel of the Lord, who I believe and many other scholars believe is God in a physical form, and those 2 angels, and they shared a meal together. They could be seen with the human eye. They could be touched. They were in the physical world. So these heavenly beings, these Elohim, these sons of God, they saw the daughters of men, saw they were beautiful, and took for them as wives. And so this is a step outside of the designed order of God. This is a rebellion. And look at what happens. If we skip forward to verse 4, it tells us the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also after this. Now that's an important phrase because we need to understand the Nephilim were on the earth in the days before the flood. That's where we are right now. And we also see the Nephilim existing after the flood. And there are numerous reasons why this may happen, and we'll talk more about that as we get closer to it. But it's this idea that there were children from the physical union of heavenly beings and earthly beings. And they call them the Nephilim. Other places in the Bible refer to them as the Rephaim or the Anakim. These are all the words that were used to refer to the children of heavenly beings and earthly beings. And look at what it says in verse 4b. For when the sons of God would sleep with the daughters of humankind, who gave birth to their children, they were the mighty heroes of old, the famous men. Now, different people have come up with different ideas of what this meant. But there's something very clear going on, that the children of heavenly beings and earthly beings were special. They were different from other people. They were the Nephilim, the Anakim, the Raphaim, the giants. These were heroes of old. Other translations say men of renown. And one of the theories that I believe is the most plausible is that this explains the reason why cultures all over the world in the ancient world believe in something called demigods. You know, this is a silly picture from Disney's movie Moana, but this is a picture of Maui. And he's a Polynesian demigod. That he was a human that was capable, because of his connection to the gods and his magical fishhook, to pull islands out of the water, to grow trees, he taught them civilization, he brought them fire and you know, brought them community, taught them how to live off the coconuts and the you know, the sustenance of the islands. That was what they believed. But there are many other stories of demigods all over the world, whether it's the Greco-Roman world of Hercules or Perseus, or Achilles, who were children of gods mixing with human beings, or numerous other cultures that tell stories of this. And as you look at the narratives of the ancient world, there is a common narrative that giants came to their land and taught them civilization, warfare, and brought evil with them. Now, depending on which culture you look at, for example, in the Norse mythology, the Jotnar were giants that fought against the gods. So they weren't actually friendly with the gods. They fought against them. The Greeks called them the Titans. In Japan, they were the Oni. I mean, every nation around the world, every major nation in the ancient world appears to have something connected to this idea of giants. In Peru, the Huaracocha were a race of giants who came after a great flood, after a global flood, and the flood went away after this great flood. They came to Central America and taught the Peruvians how to build buildings and create civilizations and farm the land, and they taught them how to build temples to align with the stars and worship the gods. And so the narrative that we find all throughout the world in different mythologies aligns with the teachings of the Bible, that these Nephilim were the demigods of old. They were heroes of renown. They had incredible knowledge. They had incredible power, incredible strength. Many of the ancient cultures say that the giants came and helped them build their cities, helped them build their monuments. And the reason I point this out is not to say that this is absolutely true, but large collections of legends and myths that tell similar stories must be considered as having a grain of truth. All over the globe, there are nations that tell stories of a worldwide flood, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh. But nations all over the world tell this story. And most Christians are perfectly happy to say, see, this is evidence of the flood. Then why would this also not be evidence of the Nephilim? according to many cultures, there were some Nephilim that existed before the flood, and there were some that came around after the flood. This could happen because maybe the Nephilim were powerful enough to survive the flood, or it could be that more heavenly beings rebelled against God and came down and had children with human beings. Either option is plausible, even if the Bible doesn't say. What the Bible does say, as we go further into it, as that there are giants, there are Nephilim, Anakim, or Raphaim on the earth even after the flood. When David goes to fight Goliath, it's after the flood, and there are giants on the earth that are referred to by the same racial names, the Anakim, Rephaim, or the Nephilim, that refer to the giants of these strong people that are the hybrid unions of heavenly beings and earthly beings. And they made these demigods. This is why, I believe, nobody wanted to fight Goliath. It wasn't just that he was a giant, that he had been a warrior his whole life. It was that he represented spiritual warfare, that this, seeming human was a demigod, and nobody wanted to fight him until David comes along and tells King Saul, this guy has defied the armies of the living God. That's why I can go defeat him, because Yahweh is on my side. This guy represents evil. I represent the one true God. And all throughout the world, we see these stories of the giants who lead the people in all kinds of evil idolatry, pagan worship, and all kinds of heinous acts. This is why, in the book of Joshua, God tells Joshua for some nations to just drive them out. He says, you don't have to kill them, just drive them off the land. This is the land I've preserved for you. But the other nations that are there, I want you to destroy them entirely. The reason for this is if you look at the table of nations that we'll look at in just a minute, these were the nations that were the Nephilim, the Anakim, the Rephaim. These are all giants, and he says kill them all. Is that because God is evil and mean? Excuse me. No, it's because God is trying to get evil off of the planet and quit leading humans to worship other gods and commit these heinous pagan practices. It's like a surgeon who has a patient with gangrene all through their arm, and to save their life they have to amputate the arm. That's a very, very terrible thing, to have to lose an arm or a body part. But if it saves the person's life, it's worth it to amputate it. If it gets rid of the gangrene, gets rid of the infection, so that the rest of the body can be healthy. That's why God tells Joshua to completely annihilate every single person in these other cities, because they were the giants. They were the Nephilim. And we see this idea all throughout the world. Why? Because I believe they actually existed. So when we talk about the Elohim, and we go back to look at this, we have to recognize that, as we've already said, Elohim is what they are, but they have many jobs. Some of them, as we've already talked about, guard God's sacred space. Others are messengers. And so as we look at what they can be, accusers, protectors, guardians, warriors, even counselors that actually are asked for advice by God. That sounds crazy, but it's in Scripture. So we've waited long enough. Let's talk about this word angels, or angelos in Greek. The Hebrew word malach, or the Greek word angelos, refers to a job that an Elohim can have. The term refers to heavenly beings that are messengers. But the word, it means messenger, so it can also refer to human beings who deliver messages, even though this is a rare use of it. So the person that delivers my mail, a very kind lady, mail lady is not who she is, it's her job. She is a human being. Mail lady is what she does. Human is what she is. Elohim is what the heavenly beings are. Angel is their job description. We see in the book of Revelation, though, this word angelos used to refer to human beings. When the Apostle John is given the message from God on the island of Patmos to give to the churches, it says, give this message to these churches and their angels. And we know from the context that God is not telling John something to tell to heavenly beings. If God wanted to give the heavenly beings the message, he could give it straight to them. He's giving it to John to give to a human being who is the messenger, who's delivering the letters from John to those churches, because the word angelos means messenger. Now, this is important because as we move to the New Testament, the same words that we saw for sons of God is now going to have a different name. Let's go to the book of Jude. He says this in Jude chapter 1, because Jude's only one chapter. In verse 6 says, "You also know that the angels who did not keep within their proper domain, but abandoned their own place of residence." Who did that? We just saw that in the book of Genesis, the sons of God, the Elohim. And now in Greek, they're referred to as angels. They left their proper domain in the spiritual world. God kept them under in eternal chains in utter darkness, locked up for the day of judgment. So according to Jude, and we also see this echoed in the book of Peter, 1 Peter, he talks about how after these heavenly beings left their place in heaven to have children with the human beings, that after this, God punished them. He locked them up in chains of utter darkness. Do you know what that actually, the word is there? It's not chains of utter darkness. It's the word Tartarus. God has kept them in Tartarus. If you know your Greco-Roman mythology, you know that Tartarus is the land under the earth where the Titans were kept. After Zeus and the other gods rebelled against them, they were held in chains under the earth in Tartarus. And so Jude is borrowing from their mythology a word that his people would have understood to represent what God has done to these heavenly beings, these angels. He has them chained up for utter darkness. And we see when we get to the book of Revelation, the lake of fire was intended for Lucifer and these angels, the ones who rebelled long ago. So we've seen the consequences of the third rebellion. The third rebellion was heavenly beings. These Elohim who left their place in heaven, came to earth, left the spiritual world, came to the physical world, and married human beings that had children with them, and brought the demigods on the planet, brought the Nephilim, who traveled throughout the whole world, leading these other nations in pagan idolatry and heinous practices and warfare and civilization and technology that led them away from God. Why did I spend so much time on that? Because we're going to see as we keep reading the next results of that. That because of all the evil in the world, we get to rebellion number 4. Human beings rebel again. The first human beings to rebel were Adam and Eve, but now human beings have rebelled. Now, the wickedness that came on the earth because of the Nephilim, that taught human beings how to be more evil than they were on their own, God sends a flood to kill all the human beings, but he saves the line for Messiah through a family of a man named Noah. And human beings begin to repopulate the earth. And they gather together at a place known as Babel. And if you grew up in church, or maybe even if you didn't, maybe you're familiar with the narrative of the Tower of Babel. You see, many ancient cultures built pyramids and monolithic structures, or even megalithic, if you want to think of it that way. Some of them were smooth-sided pyramids, like the ones in ancient Egypt, in Giza, but most of them were step pyramids. Maybe because they're easier to make, I don't know, but they were meant to replicate a mountain. Because remember, mountains were sacred, places in cosmic geography to get closer to the heavens. And so in their worship of their gods, they wanted to get as close to the heavens as possible, so they built these big temples. But what we see here in this rebellion has a little bit of a nuance to it, that as people come together, they want to rebel against God and not follow his will. Let's see what that rebellion was. In Genesis 11, it says, "The whole earth had a common language and a common vocabulary. When the people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there." Some translations say in the land of Babylon. This is in Iraq today. That they found the plain of Shinar and they settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They had brick instead of stone and tar instead of mortar. Then they said, "Come, let's build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves." So the goal here is to build a tower that goes way up into the heavens, that's super tall. Why? He says, "Otherwise we will be scattered across the face of the earth." Now this is important, because it connects back to the command of God to Adam and Eve. He told them to do what? To fill the earth and govern it, to go throughout the world and fill it with your families and your offspring. Your children will go fill the earth with more human beings so they can govern it. This group of people, though, say, no, we don't want to be scattered. We don't want to follow Yahweh. And as a result, God ends up doing some amazing things. But before we get to that, there's a very interesting commentary made in the Targums by the rabbis who wrote it. Their commentary says that the Tower of Babel was not built to worship a pagan god. It was actually built to protect that group of people in case God flooded the earth again. And they recognized that God flooded the earth because of human rebellion before against God. And so now they're like, if God floods the earth again, now we have a tower that's tall enough that we can survive the flood. And so then, as a result of this scattering, we get what is known as the Table of Nations. This is where the descendants of the people went and scattered throughout the world because they did not speak the same language and they did not stay in that same town anymore. God confused their languages and they separated into different nations. Most of us are familiar with that. Some of us are even familiar with the reverse Babel on the day of Pentecost. When the Holy Spirit comes after the resurrection of Jesus, he said, go to Jerusalem and wait for the Spirit to come on you with power. And one of the spiritual gifts that was given to people was the ability to speak in tongues, to speak in languages. And God used the gift of tongues to speak to people in different languages supernaturally to bring them back together as one people, the reverse Babel. But there's a consequence because of this. You see, human beings have rebelled against God. And now God says, okay, I have to do something different. God actually chooses at this point to delegate authority to his divine counsel. This is something that was never taught to me growing up in church. I didn't even really learn about it in my years of seminary and Bible college. I didn't learn this until I read the work of Dr. Michael Heiser a few years ago, and sadly he passed away, but he left a legacy of material behind. If you have not listened to him, I encourage you to do so. But he creates a group of heavenly beings who are his counsel, who he asks for advice. And we see all throughout Scripture this heavenly counsel show up. Psalm 82, in David's vision in the book of Daniel's vision, in the book of Daniel, in the book of Kings, 2 Kings, when the prophet Micaiah tells the judgment against King Ahab. That judgment came from God's divine counsel. We see this in numerous places. In the book of Job, God sits with his divine counsel, his heavenly court, and asks them what they have seen in the earth. And so God has a counsel. The Bible is very clear about that. What does he do with that counsel? This is where it gets interesting. If you go to Deuteronomy 32, we find a very interesting passage that I've read before but never made the connection until I read the work of Dr. Heiser. Look at what we read in Deuteronomy 32, starting in verse 7. Remember the ancient days. Bear in mind the years of past generations. Ask your father, and he will inform you, your elders, and they will tell you. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided up humankind, where did God divide up humankind? He did it at Babel. Babel was where people were divided into nations. How did he do that? He set the boundaries of the people according to the number of the heavenly assembly. Other translations say the divine council, the heavenly court. God now delegates the rule of the earth. Yes, Lucifer has now become the god of this world, but in an effort to stem his evil, God takes his trusted heavenly advisors and he delegates authority to them, and he says, now you're in charge of the nations. That there are 72 of them, 72 nations in the Table of Nations. It's really interesting that when Jesus sends his disciples out to tell them that the kingdom of heaven has drawn near to humanity again, he tells them to do that. He sends them out in groups of 2 and 72 disciples total. Isn't that interesting? That Jesus sends out the same number of disciples as God assigned his divine counsel to rule over the earth. And this is the consequence of the rebellions. That Adam and Eve were led astray by Lucifer, and they all rebelled against God, kicked out of God's sacred space. The heavenly beings rebelled against God, choosing human beings as their wife and having the Nephilim as children. The Nephilim lead human beings into evil practices, which cause them to rebel against God at Babel. And God takes away the authority of the earth from human beings and reassigns it to his divine counsel. That's the recognition of where we are in the story. In our next lesson, we will look at two more rebellions and then begin to move into some of the other spiritual beings that are mentioned in the Bible to understand who they are, what their jobs are, and how they interact with the physical world. So, as we finish this time up and we recognize that this is where we are in history, I hope this makes sense to you. Hopefully this has opened up your eyes. But if you have questions, if you say, James, this doesn't make sense, I'm pushing back against it, I want to talk to you about this, I disagree with you, or this is radical and I've never considered it. If you want to contact me, of course you can using this information, jjohnson@honeylakeclinic.com, or of course call me or text me on my phone. So thank you for joining us for this lesson. Look forward to having you join us for the next one. Until then, be blessed.